this is a presentation that Adam and I often give to new clients and or executive teams at new clients, just to help them understand, if we have to give you a summary view of what it's going to take to be successful in a project and what it's going to take to navigate some of the pitfalls and avoid some of the failure points that Marcus talked about earlier today. What are those things? And really building on both what Marcus and Stuart talked about earlier, as well as what I talked about in the opening session. So we want to just provide an executive summary of transformation best practices. And Adam, chime in at any point, add color commentary, cut me off, and certainly anyone else who wants to jump in and interrupt with questions, or first of all, you're not interrupting, but hopefully you know what I mean. Just chime in with any chat questions you have in the chat box there, either on whatever platform you're watching this on. And I'm keeping an eye here on LinkedIn as well for anyone that might have comments on LinkedIn that's watching there. So the first thing to understand is diving a little bit deeper into understanding what is digital transformation. What is that overview of what digital transformation is? And we've talked a lot about this between Stuart's presentation and mine, just some of the emerging technologies, the different buzzwords and acronyms and types of technology that are being used in digital transformation. I guess the short summary, without rehashing everything that Stuart just talked about, there's a lot of stuff out there. There's a lot of technology emerging. There's a lot of options when it comes to digital transformation. Digital transformation can mean a lot of different things to different people and to different organizations. And it should mean different things to different organizations. It should align with what it is you're trying to accomplish. And that's one of the keys to keep in mind. And there is no one size fits all answer. There's no cookie cutter approach. There's no silver bullet. I mean, hopefully that's a theme that you're picking up on here with us and our technology agnostic view of the world, is that, what might work for one organization doesn't make sense for another organization, and vice versa. So we've got to figure out what the right path forward is for us as an organization. And one thing that is helpful, though, to understand, and again, there's no right or wrong answer here, is to understand, what is a true digital transformation versus a more of a traditional technology implementation. And in this slide here, we compare, call it your traditional ERP implementation that, would have been relevant 20 years ago, to maybe a more comprehensive, bigger picture view of digital transformation, which is what you see on the right. And again, even though I think the bias here is to assume that digital transformation is better than ERP implementation or traditional technology implementation, that may or may not be true. It really does just depend on what it is you're trying to accomplish. For a lot of organizations, doing a more incremental improvement or upgrade to their existing ERP system or their enterprise technologies can make a lot of sense, especially if what you've got is a pretty good starting point, especially if you're risk adverse, especially if you have other competing priorities that you don't want to throw in a big, massive transformation in the middle of. Then a more incremental ERP implementation can make a lot of sense. For other organizations, maybe on the other extreme, you're going to have more massive external impacts that might force you into a transformation. So, for example, you look at industries such as retail that's being disrupted significantly, or was already being disrupted significantly, and then COVID came along and disrupted it even more. And retail is a good example of an industry that, if they haven't digitally transformed yet, they're way behind, and they're being forced to in that space. And so, most organizations are going to be somewhere in the middle. They're going to be somewhere between, small incremental baby steps and big, massive transformation. Most organizations are going to be in the spectrum or the continuum, somewhere in the middle. So the key here is to understand, what is the difference between the two extremes, and most importantly is to really have clarity and definition of what exactly it is where we fall on the continuum. And that's really the key. Is if there's one takeaway I could leave you with on this slide, it's just be sure you understand what it is you're trying to accomplish. Are you trying to accomplish an incremental, call it traditional ERP technology upgrade or implementation? Or are you really trying to swing for the fences and really look for ways to improve your processes significantly, and to rethink your business model, and to standardize processes or to integrate processes? Whatever the goals and objectives are, those are all the things that you want to try to make sure you have alignment and clarity on. Now, when you look through each of the line items here, with the technology, the process management, change management, business value, all the row headings that you see on the left, you can see what the differences are between the two. And again, there's no right or wrong answer. It's just a matter of being clear about where it is you are, and making sure your team's clear about where it is you fall on this continuum, and then defining a path forward that aligns with that clarity. So I mentioned in the first presentation today that one of the biggest challenges, or one of the biggest root causes of failure, is lack of alignment and misalignment as an organization. And this is a good example of how teams oftentimes get really misaligned. They go in thinking that, for example, they'll go in thinking that, hey, we're going to do this big, massive digital transformation. We're going to implement enterprise-wide technology. We're going to rethink our business processes. We're going to reimagine the art of the possible, and all these, big buzzwords that industry analysts and us consultants like to throw out there. But then when they go to plan and execute, they treat it like an ERP implementation. They plan as though they're managing a more, traditional ERP upgrade. And that right there, you're starting out of the gates with misalignment, and you've got an unrealistic view of what the path forward really should be versus what it is. And you can see how quickly you get pretty tangled up, and your team's going to get tangled up, and it can be very difficult to succeed in that kind of environment when you have those sort of headwinds working against you. So that's one of the big challenges that we see, in this. And so that's probably the big takeaway here, is just really understand what it is you're trying to accomplish between ERP implementation, digital transformation, or somewhere in between, and getting alignment on what that means to the overall transformation and the overall plan.
I think something that's important on that to note as well is that from an ERP implementation perspective, that's a bit more of a prescriptive technological solution, whereas the digital transformation is something that should be ongoing. You should always be transforming your business to remain at the forefront of your industry, and is a bit more driven towards what the organization and your business needs, as opposed to a specific solution that would solve a number of your potential digital transformation needs and goals, but shouldn't be the actual answer. So as an enabler, the ERP is the technology that enables a pretty significant chunk of your digital transformation, but isn't the actual transformation itself.
Yeah, great point. And that's an important takeaway there, is to ensure you've got that understanding going in here. The other thing to think about too is what are those challenges of digital transformation? And this is actually a top 5 list based on our research and experience, and we published this in our 2021 digital transformation report, which you can download on our website. And something tells me that Kyla is probably going to put up a link in the chat box, like she has been throughout the whole session here today, so that we'll have a link there for you to potentially do that. But in that study, or in that paper that you'll see, the top challenges that organizations face, and this isn't just our opinion, this is what organizations state and what the project teams are saying are their challenges and issues they face. The number one challenge is change management and managing the people part of the equation. The second thing is misalignment with strategic objectives, and that's the key that we were just talking about on the previous slide, just making sure that there's a good deal of clarity on what those strategic objectives are and how this transformation lines up with that. And then number 3 is managing the system integrator, and making sure that you don't view the system integrator as an end-all be-all, as a one-stop shop, because they really aren't. They may be a one-stop shop in terms of the technology work stream, but when you look at the business process and the organizational change work streams, that's typically areas that system integrators are not very well versed in. Or if they do have competencies in that area, it's very superficial, and it's very much focused on the technology and how to use the technology versus how to transform the business and define business processes and that sort of thing. So that difficulty managing the system integrator is a big challenge. And then number 4 is clarity of business processes, making sure that you have clarity around what those business processes are going to be. And then 5th is difficulties with data migration. So those are really the top 5 challenges that organizations face. And I'm getting some comments here that the slide is blurry. And there is a lot of text here, a lot going on here, but hopefully you can at least read the bullet or the bolded areas. And if not, I've verbalized for you what those 5 things are. And again, we'll make sure you have a link, or you do have a link here in the chat box. If you want to download that report, you can actually see this exact graphic in that report. So if you want to check that, that's probably going to be easier for you to read or refer back to. And it actually goes into more detail on these 5 areas as well in that report. So if you're watching here on Crowdcast, just be sure you click that link to get the report. So one thing I'll note here is that none of these 5 things, except for maybe the 5th one, the data migration one, really have anything to do with the technology or the software itself. These are all issues related to business processes, organizational change, and I'd call it project governance as well. So just food for thought there as you think about where are you most likely going to run into trouble. I heard Marcus say, yeah, you sometimes do have issues with technology, and you can certainly find a way to mess that up if you start to customize software, or if you don't really think things through or test the software. You can certainly run into issues there. But back to a point I made in the first session, it's usually fairly black and white or relatively black and white on the technology side. Either the technology works or it doesn't from a technical perspective. But the gray area comes down to, yes, it works technically, but does it work for our business, for our organization? And that gray area is where most organizations struggle, where most organizations don't spend enough time and money. And so it's really a matter of maybe shifting your mindset a little bit to focus more on those other areas. And then another challenge that we see is that in that same report, in that same link that you see that Kyla provided here, you can see that one of the biggest challenges that organizations face is this whole concept of operational disruption. So we spend so much time thinking about what is our cost of implementation? How long is it going to take? How much of people's time is it going to take? And we tend to try to optimize or minimize that amount of time or that amount of time and that overall cost without thinking about the longer term implications. Yes, we could certainly cut costs and reduce the implementation duration and reduce the amount of impact that this has to our resources during the implementation. We could always do that. But the question becomes, but what does that do longer term to our total cost of ownership, the total cost of the implementation, either because we had to fix things that went wrong in the implementation in the first time, or what's even more costly is when you have this operational disruption where, yep, we went live, but we couldn't ship product. We couldn't close the books. We couldn't invoice customers. We couldn't collect cash, whatever the problem statement is. A lot of organizations run into that sort of challenge. And in fact, in our research over the years, and this actually goes back over a decade, we've managed this, or we've measured this one metric of what is the operational disruption, and just over 50%, between 51 and 54%, it's always fallen in that range every year we've conducted the study. Just over half experienced some sort of material operational disruption, not just your usual, it was a little bit harder than we thought, or it took us a little bit of time to get used to the new system. We're not talking about that. We're talking about we couldn't ship product. We couldn't close the books. There's some major disruption to our business, and half of organizations are facing that problem when they go live with new technology. And when you look at what the impact to the overall total cost is, or how much that operational disruption costs relative to the cost of the actual implementation itself, usually when there is that sort of operational disruption, those costs will dwarf the cost of the implementation itself. So, I think back to early in my career, one of the first projects that I had managed from soup to nuts, from selection all the way through implementation, was for a mid-sized manufacturer in the U.S., and they had European operations as well. So a multinational mid-sized organization, manufacturer of engineer to order or make to order types of products. They made pressure gauges and pressure gauges for like oil pipelines and gas pipelines and water mains and things like that. And they had implemented a manufacturing ERP solution. I remember that there was a couple decision points along the way where we had decided to, or we had recommended that they push out the go live because they had decided to do a bunch of customization to address some of the unique factors of their business, and that was pushing the timeline out. And I remember it was the second time the go live had been shifted. It had already been shifted 2 times, and we were recommending a third shift by 30 days to push it out 30 days to make sure we had time to finish the testing and to get through the the wrinkles in the system that they were deploying. And the CEO, I still remember the CEO said, look, we've got to cut our losses. We've got to stop the bleeding. This is taking too long, taking too much time and money. We need to just go live. And, of course we recommended, okay, we don't recommend you do that. Here are the risks, just to make sure you're aware of the risks. And they said, okay, we get it, but we still want to go live. So long story short, we helped them through the go live, and it was a mess. They went live, and they, at the end of the day, they lost so many customer orders that they're about $100 million US company in annual revenue. They had lost, and when I say lost, I don't mean like it just took them a little bit longer to fill the order, or they had to delay these orders. They actually lost $10 million, over $10 million of orders in those first 2 to 3 months after go live. And so you look at the cost, take the profit margin on whatever that $10 million of sales was, call it, 1 or 2 million in lost profit. You compare that to what was going to be about, if I remember correctly, somewhere between $60,000 and $70,000 it would have cost to extend the go live, that extra 30 days to go through the diligence and the testing. So they made that trade-off, or that conscious decision, that we want to save that $60,000 or $70,000. So they did do that. They gained that $60,000 or $70,000, but they lost however many millions of dollars in profit on that. Lost $10 million in sales. So that's the way you kind of have to think about this. Is it's never an easy answer, and there's never a good answer when you get into those types of situations. But you do want to make sure you have a clear understanding of what the real impact is to the organization, and the real cost as well. And then, the variables that had the strongest impact on operational disruption, just in case you can't read the box on the right there, the biggest variables were clarity of business processes. Those that have tighter, better defined processes tended to have less operational disruption. Those that invested in change management tended to have less operational disruption. Those that had alignment among the executives and key stakeholders had less disruption, as did those that spent time and effort on the user acceptance testing and conference room pilots, and making sure they almost over invested in that process to make sure they worked out all the kinks and the wrinkles. And again, there's a big difference between the technology working and the system integrator delivering a working system from a technical perspective versus one that actually works for your business and it can actually function within your business. Those are two very different things oftentimes.
Yeah, and Eric, it looks like we have some questions specifically on budgeting for organizational change management. Can you talk about how you might do that within this process?
Sure. We get that question a lot, and that's a tough one to answer because I don't have a hard and fast metric. Typically what we do is we'll go in and do an organizational assessment to figure out, what is the culture of the organization? How big is the change? Because obviously if it's a bigger change, that's going to require more organizational change management. How quickly are you trying to make the change? How willing and able and skilled are your people in migrating to that change? Those are all things that affect the amount of time and money and effort it's going to take to invest in change management. But a good metric that I've used, and I think I've seen this from, I don't remember if it's Gartner or one of the big industry analyst firms. I thought I had seen in the past, and I've always had it in my mind for the last several years, it's somewhere between 15 and 20% of the total budget should be invested in change management. And what you find is it's usually a tiny fraction of that. I mean, oftentimes you're lucky to get a couple percentage points of a total budget on the overall implementation. But what I would say though, here's the other thing. You hear post-mortem, you often hear clients complain about, they spent too much time and money on the project. Oftentimes we spent too much time and money just trying to get the technology configured and customized and tested and all that stuff. But I've never heard a client say, yeah, we spent way too much money on change management. It's usually we should have spent more on that and less on the technology. So the more you can simplify some of the technology work streams and focus more on the human pieces, I'd rather take a underwhelming technical solution, but have a really good change management solution. That's probably going to be a better bet than trying to swing for the fences on the technology side, but then under investing in the human side.
I would agree with that. The overall point here is to enable your business to function more effectively, and it's a far better scenario to implement bad software very well than it is to implement very good software poorly.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of what complicates that point, Adam, is that vendors and system integrators they're selling you on this vision of what their technology can do and how great the technology is. And back to Stuart's presentation and even mine at the very beginning of today, you kind of look long term what things could be like 10 years from now, and then you try to cram that all into a 12 or 18-month implementation. It's just not going to happen. So you've got to figure out how do we maybe back off those expectations and say, okay, that might be where we're going to be in 10 years, but in 2 years we might just be happy automating our, getting some real simple GL and accounting software in place. Maybe that's okay. Maybe that's a, good risk reward trade-off there.
Yeah. And we've got 2 questions about defining processes, judging whether or not processes are defined well enough, and then also with how important are edge cases in the process design. Those are kind of intertwined, I would say. And Eric, I'd be curious as to what your thoughts are here too. But from a perspective of defining your current state, before your implementations, not quite as necessary as the detail that you get into in defining your processes in the implementation. And every possible scenario should be accommodated in a system or known that it's not going to be in the system. From a you can call them edge cases, you can call them exceptions. Your ERP, you don't choose one and implement it for the happy path in your business processes. So having everything down to the nittiest grittiest detail is really important to being successful in your implementation on the whole, and not just creating it in that space, but also implementing it down to that and testing it down to that space with real data is really how you get to the point of the highest degree of success in your business processes and in going live and testing those edge cases with real data. Knowing where some of them are, you're always going to have unknown unknowns that come up throughout the process, but knowing that you're getting everything and getting coverage of the whole of your business is really critical to success, because it's very frequently the edge cases that cause the biggest breakages.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes those edge cases can bring the operations to its knees, or depending on what it is or how customer facing it is, of course. But that's a good point. And you're never going to cover every single exception or scenario. There's always curveballs that you get in your day-to-day operations. But if they're known curveballs or known exceptions or things that are difficult, or where you have some sort of unique workaround right now, I agree with you. That's what's going to mess things up or tangle things up when you get into a real world environment. And the question here about how do you know if the processes are defined enough? I think Liam asked that question around how do you know if they're defined enough? The way I always think about it is, I'm not sure if anyone on the conference here today is familiar with that level 1 through 5 methodology or nomenclature for business process definition. But to simplify it, it's level 1 is sort of your macro process at a real high level. Level 5 is getting down to the real granular keystroke transactional workflows, and then levels 2 through 4 kind of incrementally working their way down to level 5 level of detail. But when you're evaluating technology, usually you're kind of at that level 1 and 2. You're up at the macro level. You're defining your business processes in a way that's helping you evaluate and choose the right technology that's the best fit. You don't want to get down to level 3, 4, 5 because that's dependent on what technology you deploy. But when you've selected the software and then you start moving into implementation, what ends up happening is the system integrator generally wants to dive straight down into level 5. So they're just trying to figure out, okay, how do I build these workflows in the system and start training people on the workflows? But then you miss that middle part. So usually when we do the implementation readiness or that pre-implementation planning, we suggest getting a little bit deeper, maybe down to level 2 and 3 level of granularity, just so you have a pretty clear blueprint of how you want the technology to be deployed. And then you have better direction to give to your system integrator on, kind of here's our roadmap or here's our blueprint for what we want. Now let's fill in the blanks of how the technology is going to fit within that. And let's reconcile where maybe the technology can't support that. But at least then you have a clear blueprint for where you want to go. So I think that's an important step that gets missed more often than not, and that creates a level of misalignment too, because if your transactional workflows down here are working, but they're not aligned with those high level macro business processes, you need to connect those dots and get them aligned in the middle there. Those are good questions. So with that being said, let's dive into what are those keys to transformation success. And there's actually 8 of them that we'll cover. And these are the sort of the high level themes that you may have picked up on, or we may have alluded to throughout other presentations, and some of this may be new. But the first thing to keep in mind, or the first tip, if we're to summarize 8 things for sort of an executive level executive summary, is that first of all, failure can be avoided. Even though the statistics are pretty dismal, even though a lot of research shows that upwards of 80% of transformations fail. I just shared with you the statistic that over half of implementations suffer from some sort of material operational disruption. It may sound like it's sort of a lost cause. It's just we're doomed for failure. We're doomed for all this pain. And the reality is it's not true. I mean, it shouldn't be a surprise to most organizations that go through failure, but it ends up being a surprise because they're not well educated. They've been misled by their system integrator or their vendor, or they just don't know any better. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why they're surprised by it, but they shouldn't be. If they just educate themselves and understand lessons from others and understand what some of the key themes for success are, then they will succeed. And usually you can tell by looking at a number of different criteria. You can sort of tell whether or not a project's going to be a success or failure. Now, granted, not to say that there's situations where there's never challenges. Every project has its challenges and tough points in the project, but usually you can tell those that are going to succeed versus the ones that fail based on what they're doing. And a lot of those decisions are made early in the transformation project. So that's probably the first big takeaway there is to understand that piece of it. The second thing is to start with a clear digital strategy. It's easy to rush into the software selection and or the implementation, but you want to make sure you have a clear vision for what it is you're trying to accomplish with the project. Are you doing this just as a technology upgrade? Per the earlier slide around digital transformation versus technology implementation. Where are you on that continuum? So have a clear long-term strategy and roadmap and understanding of what it is you're going to do to get to that long-term state of utopia that we were talking about earlier today. And again, if that state of utopia is something that's 10 years out or 5 years out or whatever it is, don't try to make that leap all at once. Too many organizations just try to make that leap because they've been sold a vision that could be allegedly be executed within 12 to 18 months or whatever the number is. But you need to be realistic about it and really understand incrementally how are we going to get there over the next however many years.
And in this space, you also want to, in defining your digital strategy and the goals that you're trying to get from this, knowing which ones which ones are more urgent and which ones require a little bit of building is important. The 2 examples I like to use in this space is, I don't know how many folks that are on green screen technology come to me with one of the first things that they ask for is advanced business analytics, advanced business intelligence. And you ask them, why do you want this? Like, well, I can't pull my finance reports out of this green screen system, so I need advanced technology to do this. What you need is financial reporting, not advanced BI yet. Like, let's see what it is comes out of the box as opposed to going straight to the most advanced stuff. Because advanced BI is, it's very cool. It does a lot of things and will enable you to make great decisions for your business. But without the right approach to it, you could overpay significantly for advanced business intelligence for just needing to close the books in less than 4 weeks, or just needing to be able to pull your financial statements without having to take 6 different sources, pull them into Excel and manipulate them. That's not advanced business intelligence. That's financial reporting. That's something that what we'd like to recommend is in that space, you replace what's there and what you need out of the box as close as possible, and then see if you need some of the more advanced technology, or did you actually get what you needed out of things once you know more about what it is you're biting off. The other part of this from a longer term perspective is things like MRP. I know Stuart was sharing the example with the Christmas trees, right? MRP is an intelligent process that's predictive, is based on demand planning, has a lot of inputs. And for something to be, for MRP to be predictive, it needs data. And your green screen data is going to be really hard for your MRP to really create a lot of value from. So if you're not running an MRP today, or it's not advanced, you may think about implementing that in a later phase as part of your digital strategy, so that you have time to get new, accurate, and very good data into your system. So then your MRP and demand planning modules can start making more predictive and effectively predictive recommendations for purchasing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of reminds me of the whole need to make sure you've got a clear understanding of what exactly you're getting. There's a lot of buzzwords floating around, but just making sure you translate that into what it's going to mean to your organization, how it's going to fit within your organization. And if it doesn't, then you have to ask yourself, well, why are we doing it? Just because they have this technology capability available to us doesn't mean we necessarily need to be deploying it, or at least not now. And speaking of that, that's a good segue into this next point, which is to let business drive the technology. The most successful projects that we've seen are the ones where it wasn't just IT leading the charge. It was more of a business focused initiative. Even if it was the CIO or IT director as the executive sponsor, or even if you did have a technical project manager internally, you still had some sort of strong business focus that treated IT more as an enabler of the business change, rather than assuming that IT was going to define for the business how the technology was going to fit within the business. So that's a really important point, because a lot of times we see a lot of businesses where the operational side will assume that the IT guy or gal is just going to take care of this, and the whole team on the IT side is going to take care of it, and just tell us what you need, and we'll support you along the way. And really, it should be flipped around. It should be the business driving. This is what we need. This is how we want to define our processes. This is what we want to be when we grow up. Now let's figure out how technology is going to fit into that, rather than the other way around. And also, you want to make sure that the transformation is closely aligned with measurable goals and just overall objectives of the organization. When we talk about organizational misalignment being a root cause of failure, a lot of times it's because the way we've defined a digital transformation isn't consistent with what we're trying to accomplish as a business. So I'll just give you an example. A lot of times we see cases where the executive or the strategic goal is to standardize business processes, to drive efficiency, and to move toward more of a shared service model where we're consolidating functions and we're starting to act like one common business with one common operating model across multiple locations. But then you get down to the digital transformation, and the path of least resistance oftentimes is to not do that, because that's painful to do those things. And so let's just sort of pave the cow paths and put technology in place in a way that's going to just enable the way we've always done things, or the way we're doing things now. And not to open a whole nother can of worms or Pandora's box here, that we could probably create a whole session on this one comment or this one thread. But I think the whole agile movement has actually made this problem worse, because now now in the name of agile, we're just going to go start doing stuff. And I know I'm oversimplifying. I'm probably offending a certain number of people in the audience today, but that's not the intent. The intent here is to look more strategically at, yes, we can go execute from an agile perspective, but when it comes to defining and planning what we want to be when we grow up and what our processes should look like, that just takes time. And agile runs counter to that. Agile says, don't spend a lot of time up front doing that. Just go build stuff and get a minimum viable product. And let's just start making some progress and getting some quick wins. Well, okay, we can get a lot of quick wins along the way, but we could be going in the totally wrong direction, getting quick wins along the way. So we've got to make sure we're going in the right direction, and we have that alignment with the overall strategy. So just some food for thought as you think about how are we going to treat this project? How are we going to plan for it? What's our strategy? How are we going to put together the plan? All that good stuff. The other, another thread here is to set realistic expectations. I mentioned before in the last session, or the first session from today, that unrealistic expectations are often the root causes of problems later on. And again, the phenomena we see, or the dynamic we see in place there is that you box in your project with some unrealistic assumptions. You assume it's going to take less time, money, and resources, and you assume it's going to be less risky than it really is going to be. And then you get into the implementation after everyone's on board with those assumptions. You get into the project or halfway through the project and realize that this isn't going to work. This was never realistic to begin with, and now we need more time and money, or we have to dramatically cut scope or cut corners just to be able to fit within this, flawed budget and timeline. So that's the big thing that we've got to keep in mind, is that you want to have those realistic expectations. And the biggest word of advice I can give is that last bullet there, which is when you get proposals from vendors, you don't want to distrust them, but you also want to ask a lot of questions, like how in the world are we going to migrate all of our data in a week, or whatever the assumption might be in their plan or in their proposal. And also look for things that aren't in their proposal that are important to the success of the project and should be built into your overall plan. So if you think of it as an overall program plan that you're managing, the technical implementer, the system integrator, or the vendor is just one part of that. So to put all your eggs in that one basket, to say whatever proposal they give me, that's what I'm going to budget on, that's flawed from the start, even if they're not being overly optimistic, because they haven't included all the other things that you're responsible for. So you're probably going to be responsible for data migration. You're probably going to be responsible for change management. You're probably going to be responsible for defining your business processes, for integrating to third-party systems. These are all things that are super critical to the project, but they typically don't build that into their plans, or if they have, it's very superficial, very tertiary at best. And add to that the fact that usually they're overly optimistic on their own work stream, and you can see how quickly you're going to end up with an unrealistic set of expectations if you don't ask the tough questions, and if you don't have the people, unbiased, agnostic people helping you that can help identify where those gaps are and where the dose of reality needs to be added.
And to elaborate on that a bit more, I think that from a vendor perspective, and there's a lot of conversations that we have on this that we should give them some credit. They know what their system can do, and there's a confirmation bias in that. They've seen their system do all kinds of things. They know it can do just about anything, but that doesn't mean that they know that it can do it well or better than anybody else's, or without the significant degree of customization, or that just because they think it can happen doesn't always mean that it can in that system in that way either. So that confirmation bias is really part of what causes a lot of those problems, in my opinion. And from a perspective of the taking things with a grain of salt and setting realistic expectations, for Rajan's question on artificial intelligence in ERP versus built-in products or other tools like Power BI, what are your expectations? The answer to which is better is what's the better fit for you. If your expectations are that it is going to do quite a lot of AI-based number crunching and decision making for you, then Power BI is not going to be able to handle that. But if it's something that is more aligned towards the business intelligence skill sets, key performance indicators, maybe a smaller software package is realistic. So think about your needs and how it is your expectations are set and what it is you're looking for software to do to meet those needs.
Yeah, really, really good points. And couldn't agree more with you. I also like Richard's comment here. I think I mentioned something about a grain of salt, and he said grain, question mark, or big pile. And that is a way to look at it. I know you might be half kidding on that comment, but you do have to, you do have to accept it for what it is when you get these proposals and these proposed budgets and timelines. Is they're trying to make a sale, and that's just human nature. Even if you assume the best in people, you have to assume that the human nature is they want to make the sale, and they're not gonna risk alarming you as a potential customer. So another point here is that implementation is more important than selection. That's one of the big findings we see with clients. It's easy to get overwhelmed with all the options out there. It's easy to get caught up in analysis paralysis. We see it all the time. especially when you get more stakeholders involved. And, on one hand, from a change management and buy-in perspective, you want people to be involved in the decision and the evaluation process. But on the other hand, that complicates things. That can slow down the decision-making process because you're never going to get all of your questions answered. You're never going to feel 100% comfortable with whatever solution or solutions you end up wanting to go with. And so you really have to find that balance between, we want buy-in, we want to do our due diligence, but we also don't want to spend way too much time and money thinking through this stuff. Because what ends up happening a lot of times is that, again, the analysis paralysis sets in and you reach a point of diminishing returns where you're never going to be fully confident and comfortable. And now we're just wasting time and money that we could be spending on the actual implementation. So if we view resources as being finite, which it is for most organizations, you really have to think about, okay, every day and week and month that we go on without a decision, or that we spend trying to overanalyze, overthink a process, or worse yet, evaluate systems that we shouldn't have been evaluating in the first place because it's just not a good fit. It doesn't, there's key requirements that we have that isn't going to be met by this technology. So why are we spending our time evaluating it? That ends up happening a lot too. So the quicker you can get through an educated and agnostic and informed evaluation and get to a decision, and then start to really focus and double down on the implementation itself, that's going to serve you a lot better. If you can have a really strong implementation on a subpar software, that's going to be a much better bet than having 100% confidence that you found the perfect technology, but then now you don't have enough time and money to implement it appropriately.
And on that, I would say that your selection, as long as your selection is enabling your implementation on the whole, where you're really starting to think future state and prepare for your implementation and treat it almost like an extension of your readiness phase, that's really the best way to use a software selection, so that you're really getting a lot out of what it is you're doing to select the system, but it's not just focused on the sheer purpose of determining whether or not you should go with one versus another, but is also gaining some additional value in the way that you'll be more ready to start. People will be engaged. Your processes can be a bit more well-defined. If you're really going to go big in the selection phase, it is more important to implement well than select well, but you should also consider that you can really get some great synergy on your readiness activities in using your selection phase to be a double-edged tool for you.
Yeah, that's a great point. You don't have to necessarily wait until you get through the selection to then think about change management, or then think about our rollout strategy and all that stuff.
Well, so many of the change management tactics, data, process improvements, you don't need software for those. You can evaluate that and get that in place, and it will make your implementation go far more smoothly, and you'll start reaping benefits earlier as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You knock out some of those critical path activities sooner. I think we've hit this point several times throughout multiple presentations today, so I won't spend a lot of time here, but there's no silver bullets. Watch out for the silver bullets. Be leery of it. Be skeptical. Sometimes I feel like that old Saturday Night Live skit with Debbie Downer, where she, someone will be talking about how they had a great time at Disneyland or whatever, and then she steps in and starts complaining about the risk of going on amusement park rides and stuff like that. If you haven't seen the skit, that's the gist of Debbie Downer. And they do it in a lighthearted way, but you kind of have to act like Debbie Downer when it comes to the over optimism that comes at you from the software vendors and system integrators. And that, healthy dose of skepticism will serve you well, just to, not assume that just because the technology is great, that it's going to be easy. Probably the best example is cloud deployments. I think that's one of the most oversold movements in the industry, even though the whole industry, as we talked about before, is moving to the cloud. And I'm not disputing the benefit of the cloud, but what I am disputing is this whole notion that cloud deployments are somehow easier, they're cheaper, they're faster, because they're just simply not. If anything, the way cloud deployments have been going recently with some of these relatively immature cloud solutions being rolled out to organizations by really big software vendors, it's actually complicating things more, to where, I would argue it could potentially be increasing time and cost for transformation. So, really watch out for that silver bullet mentality, which is, it's what we all want to hear, so it's understandable. I want to hear that there's an easy button out there. I want to hear that a cloud solution is super easy to deploy. I want to hear that my people aren't going to resist this change and that they're just going to love this technology. That's all stuff I want to hear. But what I want to hear versus reality are oftentimes very different when it comes to these transformations. And probably the most important thing is that, even if you assume the technology itself is easier to deploy for whatever reason, we still haven't addressed the really big problem, which is the people and process side of the equation. Those are always the toughest parts, I should say.
Sometimes faster is not better on that. There you go. So actually, you can go to the next one.
Yeah.
Take it. I won't steal too much of your thunder on this, but sometimes faster is more expensive, and you rush into creating more problems than solving them by moving more quickly. So I'll back off for a second here for you to get to the slide, Eric.
No, that's perfect. You're more than welcome to steal my thunder anytime. Yeah. I think you hit the point here that it's you don't. I think there's a fine line here between going fast and being aggressive in your implementation or in your overall project. You can do that if you have a solid plan and you're aligned and you've got clear direction. The problem is too often you run into this dynamic where we've selected the software, we signed the contract, the vendors and the system integrators are pressuring us now to bring on the army of people to help them start deploying, to help you start deploying the technology. And add that to the fact that there's a lot of excitement internally around this decision. Usually momentum's the highest right at the end of the selection phase, right? When you've decided that this is the path forward, that's about as high as momentum's going to ever be in a project. And that's about as high as morale is going to be on your project team. And I hate to say it, but that's typically true. And then from then, then it starts to drop once you start to get it into the headwinds and into the weeds of the what the change actually means and all the nuances that go in with it. So that dynamic oftentimes leads organizations, because they've got so much momentum, people are excited about this new path forward, vendor and system integrator are pressuring you to get started right away. It leads to this phenomena where we end up bringing in a ton of consultants that are there ready to start building stuff, but we're still trying to figure out, what are we doing here? What are our processes going to be? What are we consolidating? What are we standardizing? What are we not? And while you're making those decisions, the meter's running. You're paying for that time for the consultants to be sitting there waiting for you to decide. So you really want to take a couple steps back to take many steps forward and to be able to move faster later by getting that clear definition of plan in place. To your point, Adam, faster isn't always better, but sometimes you have to start off slow to be able to go faster later. And overall, that can be the faster and cheaper approach.
Well, it takes time for the system integrator to get their team on board too, right? So one of the biggest challenges is that sales handoff. The folks that you've been talking to most of the time, you might have one or two technical resources that you've been talking to, but you've been talking to the sales guys the whole time, and that handoff takes time. And there's an embedded assumption that because I told the sales guy, everybody at the organization knows what I told them is my most important thing. And it takes time for that message to sink in across your implementation team, your system integrators, and for them to get up and running so that your technical resources understand your business, that there's that knowledge handoff, and trying to rush that part of the implementation from a planning perspective can really start putting people in spots where they're expected to know more than they should yet.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. And then finally, as a preview of the next session, the most important thing is organizational change management, the people side of the equation. Your project will fail without it. I don't think I've ever seen a project succeed that didn't invest really heavily in change management. And even the cases that I've been involved with or that we've been involved with as a team, where they have invested heavily in change management, there's typically more you could be doing to be doing a better job in that area. And it really comes down to understanding what exactly change management is. And that, again, that's the topic for the next discussion. I just realized, Kyler, we're way over on time, so I apologize. We're throwing off your schedule here. But just at a high level, I think the one thing I'd say, short of getting into the details that we'll cover in the next session, is that change management is a lot more than just training and communications. your system integrator, your vendor is probably going to suggest a certain amount of communication and training type of activities, which is great, but that is just scratching the surface, and that's stuff that's way downstream. You need to be doing change management from day one, and that includes things like organizational design, the organizational readiness, the change impact analysis, and really targeting the communications along the way, not just what are we doing with this project, and not just when are we going to get trained on the new system. That stuff's important, but what's more important is how is this project going to affect me and my job, and how is it compared to the way I do things today, and how are you going to help me understand that and get to that point. What ends up happening too often is that you get to the training workshops, in class training or whatever it is, and people have their freak out moments in the training. They should be having those freak out moments way earlier in the process, so you can work through it and work through those kinks, so that by the time you get to end user training, it's more of a formality of, okay, I already understand that my job's changing, and I understand why, and I've already freaked out. Now you're just going to show me how to do it in the new system. So I'm oversimplifying, but that's sort of the general dynamic that we often see with change management. So make sure you have a real solid investment in change management along the way.